The spectrometer screen flickered, casting a sickly violet glow over Maria's face as the graph suddenly spiked into a jagged, crimson peak. Outside the laboratory window, the steel mill's chimneys exhaled a thick, rust-colored mist that swallowed the morning sun. But inside, the silence was even more suffocating. She checked the water sample again, her hands trembling so violently that the glass vial clinked against the metal tray. The numbers on the monitor weren't just high. They were lethal, suggesting that every person in the city had been drinking a slow-acting poison with their morning coffee. When she tried to save the data, the file directory vanished before her eyes, replaced by a cold, blinking cursor and a "System Access Denied" prompt. A heavy shadow flickered across the frosted glass of her lab door, the silhouette of someone standing perfectly still, watching. Maria realized then that the metallic tang in her mouth wasn't just the smell of the factory. It was the taste of a secret that people were already being paid to bury. And the deletion of her files was only the first step in making her disappear along with them. Maria Chandler leaned over the cuvettes of the spectrometer, her eyes narrowing against the harsh, flickering glare of the laboratory's fluorescent lights. The sterile, white illumination of Midwest Steel's testing facility bounced off the stainless steel surfaces, highlighting the fine layer of industrial dust that seemed to coat everything in Gary, Indiana. With a rhythmic, mechanical hum, the thin needle of the auto sampler descended into the murky liquid of sample Nasha 42 Gary. Maria held her breath, watching the monitor as jagged curves began to crawl across the screen. The silence of the lab felt heavy, broken only by the cooling fans of the processors. Suddenly, the absorption peak for lead spiked, tearing through the upper limit of the scale and bleeding into a violent, alarming crimson on the display. Immediately after, the cadmium levels surged, shattering the safety threshold by a factor of 10. Maria's throat tightened, a dry metallic taste coating her tongue. Through the reinforced glass window, the city of Gary lay smothered in a thick, sulphurous gray haze, a graveyard of industry. In her hands, the printed report trembled. The stark black numbers screamed of a silent slaughter flowing through the pipes of every residential block in the neighborhood. The heavy thud of the analyzer's protective cover echoed through the empty room as Maria slammed it shut. She wiped her damp, shaking palms against the stiff fabric of her white lab coat, the chemical scent of detergent mixing with the sharp tang of ozone. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with frantic precision, initiating a full recalibration of every sensor in the array. This had to be a mistake. It needed to be a calibration error. She moved to the heavy steel safe, pulling out a fresh bottle of reference solution and squinting at the expiration date on the label. The machine emitted a series of sharp, clinical pings as it reset to 0, purging the previous data. Maria carefully reloaded the same water sample, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The needle dipped again. On the screen, the same murderous geometry of the graph reappeared, identical to the last. The lead figures froze at that same lethal mark, refusing to budge a single decimal point. A cold trickle of sweat traced a path down her spine beneath her heavy work clothes, while the spectrometer methodically confirmed that an invisible killer was indeed circulating through the city's veins. Maria clutched the folder marked urgent, so tightly the cardboard began to crease. She stepped into Arthur Stevens's office, where the air was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive tobacco and aged leather. The opulence felt like an insult compared to the crumbling brick of the tenements outside. Without a word, she laid the report directly in front of Stevens, her finger trembling as she pointed to the rows of data she had highlighted in jagged red ink. Stevens didn't even blink. He remained hunched over his monitor, his eyes fixed on flickering stock tickers. Maria began to speak, her voice low and raspy. describing the toxicity levels and the immediate, dire threat to the local population. Stevens didn't interrupt. Instead, he reached out with 2 fingers and slowly pushed the folder toward the very edge of the mahogany desk, treating the evidence like a soiled napkin. Maria's voice died in her throat. She watched him return to his market charts, his indifference more terrifying than any shouting match. The suffocating silence of the office pressed down on her shoulders as Stevens pointedly moved the Midwest Steel report into a stack of scrap paper. Back at her workstation, Maria's hand hovered over the mouse. She clicked to wake the monitor, the blue light reflecting in her tired, gray eyes. She navigated to the directory for the morning's analytical runs, but her cursor hit a void. A frown creased her forehead as she double-clicked the folder again. It was empty. Frantic, she began hammering at the keys, typing the specific sample ID into the system-wide search bar. The computer responded with a cold, laconic prompt. "File not found." Her heart lurched. She checked the trash, the temporary cache, and the server backups, her breathing becoming shallow and fast. Every trace of the lead and cadmium data had vanished, wiped clean as if the morning's work had been a fever dream. Maria spun her chair around, scanning the silent laboratory. The red power lights of the security cameras tucked under the ceiling corners felt like unblinking eyes, watching her from the shadows of Midwest Steel. She tried to steady her breathing, her fingers numbing as she typed her 8-digit personal access code into the company's cloud archive portal. The screen hung for a long, agonizing second before a bright red window exploded across the display. "Access denied. Contact System Administrator." A surge of panic rose in her chest. She pivoted to the laboratory's secondary gateway, a legacy port she often used for batch uploads. But the keyboard only returned a dry, rhythmic system rejection. Maria watched in horror as the icons for the primary databases on her desktop began to gray out, becoming inactive one by one. Her entire digital footprint within the company was being erased in real time. A systematic deletion of her professional existence. Everything she had spent months documenting, every suspicious reading and anomalous trend, was now being locked away behind an impenetrable wall of revoked security protocols. Maria waited until the rhythmic thud of the security guard's boots faded into the distance of the far corridor. Working with the silent, practiced speed of a thief, she swept 3 hermetically sealed vials of nitric acid and a pack of sterile glass tubes into her leather satchel. The glass clinked softly, a sound that seemed to roar in the stillness of the lab. She quickly threw an old frayed sweater over the containers to mask the telltale shapes of the laboratory equipment. The cold glass of the reagents felt like it was burning her skin through the thin polyethylene bags. She yanked the strap of the bag tight across her chest and headed for the rear service exit, forcing herself to maintain a steady, unremarkable pace. Every creak of the linoleum under her boots felt like a gunshot, a loud proclamation of her small, desperate theft from the bowels of Midwest Steel. The engine of her old sedan turned over with a guttural, protesting roar that filled the quiet parking lot. As Maria pulled away from the factory gates, she glanced at the rearview mirror, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. A black sedan with windows so dark they looked like ink pulled out behind her, maintaining a precise 2-car distance. She took a sharp left onto 4th Avenue, her eyes darting back to the mirror. The shadow followed. When she hit the industrial bypass and pushed the accelerator, the black car matched her speed instantly, a silent predator in the gloom. The only things visible were the distorted reflections of streetlights dancing on the stranger's hood. When she finally pulled up to the curb in front of her house, the black car didn't pass. It rolled to a stop under the skeletal branches of an ancient oak across the street. its parking lights glowing like the eyes of a wolf in the dark. Maria pulled the hood of her dark jacket low over her face, crouching as she navigated the dense thicket of dry thistles and rusted scrap metal at the edge of the property. Under her boots, construction debris and shattered glass crunched with agonizing clarity. The rusted chain-link fence marking the far perimeter of Midwest Steel was a jagged mess, and she found the gap she was looking for near the old drainage culverts. She squeezed through the opening, the wire snagging and tearing at her sleeve. The air here was different, thick, stagnant, and heavy with the stench of rotten eggs and scorched iron. She clicked on her flashlight, keeping her palm pressed over the lens so only a sliver of light escaped. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, illuminating concrete troughs slick with a translucent, oily film that disappeared into the earth toward the heart of Gary. She dropped to her knees at the very edge of the embankment, where the soil was a black, saturated muck that smelled of fuel oil. Hidden beneath a pile of rusted corrugated iron and dead branches was the mouth of a massive polymer pipe. Maria watched, her breath hitching, as a thick, blue-black sludge pulsed out of the opening in a steady, silent stream. The liquid hissed as it hit the ground, bubbling and seeping directly into the porous earth of the aquifer, bypassing every mandated sensor and filtration stage of the treatment plant. She pulled a glass tube from her bag and carefully dipped it into the viscous flow. The glass was instantly coated in a shimmering, iridescent film. Maria stared at the sight, realizing she was looking at the poisonous pulse of the factory as it pumped toxin into the wells of thousands of unsuspecting families while the city slept under the cover of the Indiana night. A sudden, violent sweep of powerful headlights cut through the trees above her, illuminating the swirling mist. Maria recoiled, throwing herself backward behind a jagged pile of broken concrete slabs. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain the sound would give her away. The crunch of gravel under heavy off-road tires grew louder, vibrating through the ground. A Midwest Steel security patrol was crawling along the discharge line. She pressed her face into the cold, gritty concrete, the smell of wet stone filling her nose. The sweep of a searchlight brushed the edge of the slabs, missing her boots by mere inches. Maria squeezed her eyes shut and stopped breathing, her world shrinking to the sound of the receding engine as the patrol moved further down the perimeter road. She peered cautiously from behind her cover as the security jeep pulled to a halt at the crossroads. A local Gary police cruiser, its city crest visible under the street lamp, pulled up alongside it. Maria watched as a guard in tactical camo stepped out of the jeep and approached the officer's window. The two men exchanged a few brief words and short, familiar nods. Maria's breath caught as the guard reached into his jacket and handed the officer a thick, bulging white envelope. The policeman took it without hesitation, tossing it onto the passenger seat before offering a casual, mocking salute. Maria watched the two vehicles part ways, heading in opposite directions and leaving behind nothing but the acrid scent of exhaust and the crushing realization of how deep the rot actually went. The locks on her front door clicked into place, and Maria slid down the wood until she hit the floor of her dark hallway. The image of that envelope passing between hands burned in her mind. Midwest Steel wasn't just a factory. It was the heart of a parasite that had wrapped its tentacles around every institution in Gary. The lab deleted the evidence, the police took the bribes, and the management ignored the bodies, all while the lead slowly claimed the town. She sat in the dark, the weight of the stolen samples in her bag feeling like a leaden anchor, knowing she was now the only thing standing between the city and a silent, systematic execution. Maria burst into Thomas's cramped union office, the air inside heavy with the smell of stale coffee and yellowing paper. With a dull thud, she slammed 3 glass vials of the blue-black sludge and a stack of glossy photographs onto his heavy oak desk. The images were unmistakable. The concrete troughs hidden by brush, the illegal pipes, the black poison soaking into the Indiana soil. Thomas flinched as one of the vials rolled across the wood, leaving a damp, dark trail. Maria jammed her finger onto the photo of the camouflaged drain beneath the culvert, her chest heaving as she struggled for breath. The heavy silence of the room was broken only by the ticking of a wall clock as Thomas stared at the oily swirls inside the glass, his face turning a sickly, ashen gray under the flickering light of his desk lamp. Thomas lunged from his chair, the legs scraping harshly against the floor as he reached for the door and slammed the bolt home. He turned back, his large hands sweeping the photographs into a messy pile as if they were venomous insects. He leaned in, his voice a frantic, jagged hiss, telling Maria to get the evidence back in her bag and never to speak of it again. His face was contorted with a suppressed, shaking rage. He began to pace the small room, painting a grim picture for her. The boarded-up storefronts, the empty playgrounds, and the ghost town silence that would swallow Gary if the mill were shuttered by an environmental raid. He loomed over her, his shadow cast long against the wall, arguing that her truth would burn the lives of thousands of working families to ash, turning their home into a rotting husk. He collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his calloused hands. In a low, broken voice, he confessed to the shameful bargain he had struck. Maria listened, her stomach turning, as he described the monthly wire transfers to the union accounts, laundered as community subsidies from Midwest Steel. That money had paved the school parking lots and paid out member benefits. But the cost had been Thomas's deliberate blindness to the black streaks in the drainage ditches. Maria looked at her brother and saw a stranger, just another cog in the machine she was trying to break. He tried to explain that survival required sacrifices, that the union had traded clean air for the stability of a paycheck long ago. Every word he spoke felt like a heavy, poisonous weight dropping onto the floor, killing whatever remained of her trust in him. She fled the suffocating heat of the office, gasping for the cold air of the parking lot. As she approached her car, her heart dropped. The sedan sat low and lopsided on the asphalt. All 4 tires had been shredded, the rubber torn into useless ribbons. Protruding from the ruined casings were long, jagged steel spikes, clearly machined in the very shops of Midwest Steel. Maria reached down and touched the cold, sharp edge of a spike. It was still damp with the morning dew. The parking lot was a desert, the wind whistling through the chain-link fence. She stood alone in the emptiness, the realization sinking in that her mobility had been stripped away. The mangled car wasn't just vandalism. It was a message written in the language of the mill. Maria reached her front porch, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. She reached into the mailbox and pulled out a plain white envelope, devoid of stamps or a return address. Her fingers trembled as she tore the paper open. A photograph slid out, a shot of her nephew David, playing on the school's rusted jungle gym. The boy's face had been violently obliterated, crossed out with thick, aggressive strokes of a black, permanent marker that smelled of toxic ink. Her hand spasmed, crushing the photo into a ball. The street was silent, but she could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her from behind the drawn curtains of the neighboring houses. The message was clear. Her private life was now a target, and the factory was watching the boy. At the corner of the block, Maria saw a cluster of neighbors gathered by a weathered fence. These were people she had known for years, people who had shared coffee and complaints with her. But as she approached, their backs formed a solid, impenetrable wall. She tried to walk past, but old Mr. Grayson turned his head and pointedly spat on the sidewalk as she passed. From the center of the group, a sharp, bitter voice rang out, accusing her of trying to take the bread out of their children's mouths and sabotaging the city's future. Maria quickened her pace, the low hum of their hostile murmurs following her like a swarm of hornets. The glares of her neighbors felt sharper than the factory's wire. She saw the raw terror of poverty in their eyes, a fear so deep it made them hate the person trying to save them. She ducked into the corner grocery, hoping for a moment of normalcy. But the air inside was thick with tension. Mr. Burns, the owner, refused to meet her eyes as she placed a gallon of water and a loaf of bread on the counter. Maria swiped her debit card through the reader, but the machine emitted a sharp, grating rejection tone. Mr. Burns stared at the screen and muttered coldly that the terminal had suddenly stopped accepting her specific account. Maria could hear the people in line behind her whispering, their eyes boring into her back with a mix of suspicion and contempt. She left the groceries on the counter and stepped back out into the blistering sun, the reality settling in that Midwest Steel's reach extended to her very ability to survive in the local economy. Her phone vibrated violently in her pocket, the screen displaying the caller ID for Gary General Hospital. The nurse's voice was clipped and professional, informing Maria that David had been rushed to the emergency room. A cold wave of nausea hit her as the nurse described a critical drop in white blood cell counts that had caused the boy to collapse at school. The world tilted beneath her feet. She thought of the blue-black sludge and the poisoned wells, the water David had been drinking every day of his life. Clutching the phone until her knuckles turned white, Maria began to run toward the hospital, ignoring the ache in her lungs. The rhythmic, distant pulse of the mill seemed to grow louder in her ears, a reminder that the poison she had found was now in her family's blood. In the sterile, white-tiled hallway of the hospital, Maria collided with Thomas. His eyes were bloodshot, a volatile mix of grief and fury. He didn't offer comfort. Instead, he grabbed her by the shoulders and slammed her back against the cold wall. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot and ragged as he hissed a warning. She was never to mention the mill or the pollution in relation to David's illness. His fingers dug into her skin through her jacket, bruising and hard. He demanded her silence, arguing that the factory's private insurance fund was the only thing that would pay for the boy's treatment. Maria looked into his eyes and saw a man who had become a prisoner of his own fear, willing to bury the truth to maintain the desperate illusion of safety. Maria looked up at the television mounted in the corner of the waiting room. A local news broadcast was playing, featuring the polished, composed face of a Midwest Steel spokesperson. The anchor introduced a segment on disgruntled former employees, and Maria watched in disbelief as her own name was used. They portrayed her as an unstable, vengeful woman, acting out of personal spite. The screen flashed fabricated charts and doctored water quality reports, claiming the city's supply was pristine. The corporate suit spoke with a calm authority, dismissing her findings as dangerous rumors intended to hurt the workers of Gary. A low murmur spread through the waiting room as other parents turned to look at her, their faces hardening with the belief that she was the enemy of their livelihoods. When she finally reached her apartment, she stopped dead at the door. Splashed across the white paint in jagged, dripping red letters was the word traitor. The paint was still fresh, thick droplets running down the wood like blood from an open wound. Maria spun around, scanning the street. In the windows of the apartment building across the way, she saw the silhouettes of neighbors watching her, their faces obscured by the glare on the glass. No one stepped out to help. No one called out a greeting. The entire neighborhood, fed by the hand of the mill, had become a collective watchtower. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her keys, the crushing weight of her isolation feeling like a physical force. As her own home became a besieged fortress, she found a stack of old plywood and a heavy framing hammer in the back of her closet. The rhythmic echoing thud of metal striking wood filled the empty apartment as she began to board up the windows, sealing herself away from the judging eyes of the street. When the last nail was driven, Maria collapsed onto a hard kitchen chair in the dim, filtered light. The stolen samples sat on the table before her, the only tangible things left in a world that had turned into a hall of mirrors. She sat in the silence, the realization gnawing at her that the people of Gary had made a desperate choice. They would rather die slowly from the lead than face the immediate ghost of a dead economy. Maria pressed her back against the cold, damp concrete of the outer wall, her breath visible in the chilly night air. She waited, counting the seconds as the roar of the shift-change traffic at the main gate subsided into a heavy, industrial silence. The rusted grate of the ventilation shaft for the main smelting floor groaned as she pried it loose, a sharp protest of metal on metal. She slid inside, the air immediately turning thick with a suffocating mix of coal dust and metallic scale. The heat within the duct was a physical weight, the steel plates beneath her palms vibrating with the subterranean power of the furnaces roaring below. She crawled through the cramped, soot-clogged tunnel, the rivets tearing at her elbows, until she reached the dim, amber light of the technical mezzanine. Her heart raced in a frantic, uneven rhythm that matched the distant, earth-shaking thud of the giant presses. The air in the records archive was still and smelled of desiccated paper and the sharp ozone of humming servers. Maria dropped to her knees in front of the massive, floor-anchored steel safe, pressing a stolen stethoscope against the cold, gray door. Her fingers moved with agonizing slowness, rotating the dial and listening for the faint, mechanical click of the tumblers. When the heavy bolt finally gave way, with a muffled thud, she pulled out a series of thick, blue-bound folders. On the yellowing pages of the discharge logs, columns of handwritten figures confirmed her worst fears. Tons of lead and cadmium had been diverted into the groundwater every month for the last 5 years. She saw the bold, careless signatures of the inspectors next to notations of critical environmental failures. These pages, heavy with the scent of old ink, were the most dangerous things she had ever held. A piercing, rhythmic wail of a high-decibel siren shattered the silence of the archive, making Maria jump. Red emergency lights began to pulse under the ceiling, bathing the rows of files in a sickly, rhythmic crimson. She didn't hesitate. She shoved the journals into her jacket and bolted for the exit. Ahead, the heavy steel doors opened into the vast, roaring cavern of the open hearth shop, a hellscape of white-hot heat and blinding sprays of sparks. Security guards in dark tactical gear appeared on the high catwalks, their shouts lost in the deafening roar of the molten steel. Maria ran across the metal grating, the heat rising through the soles of her shoes until she could smell the rubber beginning to singe. The heavy thud of boots behind her echoed off the corrugated walls, the hunters closing in through the swirling haze of smoke. She found herself on a narrow, vibrating technical bridge suspended directly over a seething lake of liquid metal. A massive glowing ladle drifted slowly beneath her, radiating a wave of heat so intense she felt the hair on her arms begin to curl. A Midwest steel guard stepped onto the far end of the bridge, his face twisted into a snarl of distorted rage. He lunged, his hands clamping onto the collar of her jacket with a violent jerk. Maria teetered over the edge of the railing, the orange glow of the steel below reflecting in her wide eyes. Her fingers clawed at the safety rail as her foot slipped into the empty air. In a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, she drove her elbow into the guard's solar plexus and twisted away, leaving him gasping for air in the sulphurous, superheated gloom. The morning sun over Gary was a pale, sickly disk struggling to pierce the industrial smog as Arthur Stevens stepped onto a makeshift podium in front of the administrative offices. He adjusted his silk tie and leaned into a cluster of microphones. his voice amplified by the PA system until it boomed across the crowded plaza. He spoke to the gathered reporters, his tone one of practiced outrage as he accused Maria of grand larceny and industrial sabotage. Maria watched from the small, dusty window of a nearby maintenance shed, seeing two Gary police officers take a formal statement folder from Stevens's hand. On the giant digital billboard overlooking the street, her own face appeared under a "Wanted" banner. Stevens allowed a thin, cold smile to touch his lips, publicly branding her a criminal before the very people she was trying to protect. Maria fumbled with her debit card, trying to slide it into the reader of a secluded ATM in a quiet alleyway. The screen instantly turned a flat, clinical gray, displaying a message that her accounts had been frozen by the legal department of Midwest Steel. She tried the PIN again, but the machine merely spat the plastic card back at her. The transaction terminated by a system-level override. Her smartphone buzzed, a notification appearing that her balance was zeroed out, and her credit lines were suspended due to suspicious activity. A cold numbness spread through her fingers. The mill had effectively turned off her ability to exist in the modern world. She stood by the humming machine, listening to the indifferent whir of its internal gears, realizing she was now an outlaw with nothing but the clothes on her back and the stolen journals. The front door of her apartment groaned and then splintered under the force of a heavy shoulder. Thomas burst into the room, his face a mask of pale, sweating desperation and his eyes bright with a feverish light. He didn't speak. He began to tear the room apart, flipping the coffee table and ripping the cushions from the chairs. He screamed at her to hand over the journals, his voice cracking as he talked about the mounting medical bills and the loyalty bonus the mill had promised for David's care. He grabbed her by the wrists, his breath smelling of cheap whiskey and raw panic. He shouted that the papers she held were a death sentence for his son, his hands shaking as he threw her books from the shelves. Maria watched her brother dissolve into a man, willing to destroy his own sister for the fleeting mercy of the company. Thomas shoved Maria back against the heavy wooden dresser, the frame groaning under the impact. Stars danced in her vision, but she managed to catch his arm before he could strike again. They tumbled onto the floor, a brutal, silent struggle among the wreckage of her living room. Thomas clawed at her satchel, his breathing a series of ragged, desperate grunts. In a split second of clarity, while Thomas was tangled in the fallen window curtains, Maria yanked the journals from her bag and shoved them into a deep tear in the underside of the sofa's fabric. When he finally pinned her down, his fingers found only an empty bag. Maria lay pressed into the carpet, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. But she felt a grim spark of victory, knowing the evidence was hidden in the one place he wouldn't think to look. The air in the Gary Sheriff's office was stagnant, smelling of old cigarettes and floor wax. The sheriff didn't even look up from his desk as Maria described the assault and the threats from the mill. He sat there, slowly rotating his heavy brass badge between his thumb and forefinger, his eyes fixed on the distant smokestacks visible through the window. He cut her off mid-sentence, his voice flat and dismissive, stating that his deputies had found no evidence of a struggle and that she was clearly suffering from a breakdown brought on by David's illness. Maria noticed a new commemorative calendar on his wall, emblazoned with the Midwest Steel logo. He leaned forward and advised her to go home and stop bothering the department with fantasies before he was forced to commit her to the psychiatric ward for her own safety. Maria stood by the narrow slit in her boarded-up window, her eyes fixed on the town square. Below, crews of workmen in orange vests were hammering together the massive steel skeleton of a celebratory stage. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoed through the streets as a giant banner was unfurled. Midwest Steel, 50 years of progress. The fabric climbed the side of the city hall, masking the cracked masonry. She watched the trucks unload crates of fireworks and sound equipment, while private security guards began to establish a perimeter with heavy steel barricades. The city was preparing to worship its own executioner. Maria gripped the windowsill until her knuckles ached, knowing that this choreographed triumph was the only stage large enough for her to finally break the silence. In the dim, flickering light of her kitchen, Maria spread an old, heavy wool coat across her lap. She picked up a thick needle, the steel protesting as it pierced the dense lining of the garment. One by one, she began to stitch the stolen pages from the discharge logs into the interior of the coat. Her fingers bled from the repetitive pricks, but she didn't stop, moving with a methodical, grim intensity. The paper crinkled softly as it was buried beneath the wool. She knew that on the square the next day, this coat would have to serve as both her armor and her evidence. In the absolute silence of the boarded-up apartment, the only sound was the raspy pull of the thread. She tied off the final knot, feeling the new, heavy weight of the truth hanging from her shoulders. Maria stepped out into the deepening purple of the Indiana twilight, pulling the heavy coat tight around her frame. The streets of Gary were already swelling with the noise of arriving tourists and the low rumble of shuttle buses. She kept her head down, the shadow of her hood concealing her face as a black security jeep with tinted windows crawled past her, its roof-mounted lights flashing a slow, rhythmic amber. The crowd near the train station was a dense, moving mass of bodies, and Maria allowed herself to be swept up in the current. She moved with the flow, a ghost in the machine, heading toward the bright, artificial lights of the square, as the city prepared to celebrate a lie she was about to burn down. Maria pushed into the surging, restless sea of people, the air thick with the cloying scent of spun sugar and the sharp tang of cheap cologne. Brightly colored balloons bobbed against her face, providing a flickering screen that hid her from the sweeping lenses of the security cameras mounted on the lampposts. Beneath her heavy wool coat, the stiff, unyielding pages of the discharge logs scraped against her ribs with every shallow breath she took. She could feel the cold, clinical weight of David's medical records stitched against her stomach. The roar of the celebratory crowd was a physical force, drowning out the world, while the towering steel skeleton of the main stage loomed ahead, draped in festive blue silk. She gripped the edge of her coat, her knuckles white, as she slipped through the gaps between the sweaty backs of the mill workers, inching closer to the base of the podium where the subwoofers made her very bones vibrate. Arthur Stevens stepped up to the gold-plated microphone, the stage lights reflecting off his perfectly polished cufflinks. His voice, smooth and resonant, filled the square, amplified into a godlike boom that spoke of the iron-willed legacy of Gary and the unending horizon of prosperity provided by the mill. He spread his arms wide, a gesture of hollow benevolence, gesturing toward the massive, glowing logos of Midwest Steel that flanked the stage. Standing just behind him, a silent, slumped shadow, was Thomas. His cheap suit jacket hung awkwardly on his broad shoulders, and his gaze remained fixed on the scuffed toes of his work boots. He didn't join in the rhythmic clapping, his face a gray, lifeless mask in the deep shadow of the stage's overhang. A stark contrast to the radiant, artificial smiles of the corporate executives. The moment Stevens paused to take a sip from a crystal water glass, Maria lunged, ducking under the bright yellow police tape of the security line. The rubber soles of her shoes gripped the smooth, cold metal of the stairs as she scrambled upward. A guard with heavy tactical headphones was only beginning to turn his head when she cleared the first landing. The wind whipped at her coat, momentarily revealing the white flashes of paper beneath. But she didn't break her stride. Her heart felt like it was trying to punch through her ribs. She crested the top of the platform, a blur of motion past the startled assistants. Stevens dropped his glass, the water shattering across the floor. As Maria vaulted onto the center of the illuminated podium, her boots thudding against the wood just heartbeats ahead of the charging security team. She yanked the microphone from its stand, the movement so violent It sent a piercing, agonized shriek of feedback through the massive speakers, silencing the square. Stevens recoiled, his mouth hanging open in a silent gasp of shock. With a single defiant motion, Maria threw her coat open, the heavy wool spreading out like the wings of a dark, predatory bird. The thousands of workers below froze, their eyes widening as they saw the rows of original reports, their white surfaces stark against the dark lining of her coat. Under the harsh glare of the spotlights, the red critical failure stamps and the jagged signatures of the auditors were visible to every camera in the plaza. Maria stood like a living monument of evidence, the soft rustle of the paper in the wind and the only sound as the crowd began to process the lethal geometry of the numbers she had brought to light. Her voice, pushed to its absolute limit through the PA system, thundered over the silent city, echoing off the brick facades of the surrounding factories. She screamed the numbers. 500 kilograms of lead into the soil every day, 300 tons of cadmium every year. Each figure she shouted felt like a physical blow to the crowd below. Then, she began to read the names, her voice cracking as she went through the list of the oncology ward. She called out the names of neighbors, of the children from the local daycare, of the men she had worked alongside for 15 years, whose lives had been reduced to decimal points in a corporate ledger. The air on the square turned heavy and stagnant. Maria watched as men in the front rows slowly reached up to pull off their festive hats, the realization of the poison in their own blood finally breaking the back of the celebration. Stevens made a sharp, frantic motion toward the wings, and two guards with expressionless, stone-like faces charged onto the stage. Their heavy, leather-clad hands slammed onto Maria's forearms, wrenching her limbs behind her back with a sickening force. She let out a sharp cry of pain as her shoulder joints protested, but her fingers remained locked around the microphone. They began to drag her toward the rear of the stage, intent on swallowing her into the shadows behind the blue silk curtains. Her boots caught on the thick bundles of cables, sparking as she tore the connections from their sockets. Her coat groaned as the seams began to rip, the white pages of the logs tearing loose and fluttering across the stage like wounded gulls. Stevens stood by the podium, his hands trembling as he tried to adjust the microphone stand, desperately trying to maintain the facade of order, while his men used brute force to silence the truth. In a final, feral burst of movement, Maria twisted her head and sank her teeth into the guard's hand, forcing him to release her for a precious second. She reached into her coat, ripped David's medical folder from the lining, and hurled it at Thomas with everything she had left. The blue folder struck him in the chest and burst open, raining blood work charts and X-ray films across the stage. Maria screamed at him over the roar of the scuffle, her voice a raw, jagged edge as she demanded he look at the physical cost of his silence. Thomas instinctively caught the falling papers. Maria watched, pinned once more by the guards as his eyes scanned the pages, stopping dead on the bright red ink of his own son's surname. She went still in the guard's grip, watching the man who had been her brother wither as he realized the mill had been killing his child with his own permission. Thomas began to leaf through the crinkling pages, his face turning from a sickly gray to a hollow, deathly white. When Stevens tried to step forward and snatch the documents away, Thomas's elbow lashed out, a violent, instinctive shove that sent the executive stumbling back toward the speakers. The security guards froze, their eyes darting between the director and the union leader, unsure whose orders carried weight. Thomas stepped between Maria and the corporate line, his legs braced wide, his massive frame shielding her from the light. His heavy, ragged breathing was broadcast through the live microphone. He didn't look down anymore. His eyes were filled with the cold, crystalline fury of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. Stevens retreated, his polished exterior crumbling as he faced the man who now stood as the only barrier between him and the truth. Thomas stepped up to the microphone, his shoulder nudging Maria gently aside. His voice, when it came, was a raspy, broken growl that carried to the very back of the square, confessing to every cent the union had accepted to keep the mill running. He confirmed that the signatures on Maria's stolen reports were real, and that the mill's hidden pipes had indeed turned the soil of Gary into a mass grave. He looked out at the sea of faces and told them to drop their tools, to walk out of the shops, and to stop feeding the machine that was murdering their families. A profound, suffocating silence fell over the plaza. Thomas stood there, his fists clenched, as his confession echoed through the industrial canyons of the city. Maria watched as the workers in the front row began to slowly, deliberately take off their hard hats and drop them onto the asphalt. A low, rhythmic thud that heralded the beginning of the end. The square remained locked in a terrifying, expectant stillness, the only sound the snapping of the festive banners in the wind. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the rising, discordant wail of high-pitched sirens approaching from the main highway. A fleet of white SUVs, with the bold blue emblems of the Environmental Protection Agency, tore onto the plaza, their tires screeching as they cut through the crowds. Maria felt a sudden, crushing wave of relief. The files she had sent in the middle of the night had found their mark. Agents in tactical windbreakers flooded the stage, their authority quickly neutralizing the factory guards and the local police. Maria watched as the steel cuffs were snapped onto Arthur Stevens's wrists in the full glare of the national news cameras. The crowd parted like a dark tide for the federal agents. And for the first time in her life, the air in Gary didn't smell like sulfur. It smelled of the ozone of an approaching storm. A month later, Maria stood on the cracked, weed-strewn platform of the Gary train station, her hand tight around the handle of a battered suitcase. The morning fog was a cold, damp shroud that clung to the rusted girders. A stream of men in stained work jackets shuffled past her. The first wave of the thousands laid off after the EPA had padlocked the gates of Midwest Steel for good. She felt the weight of their stares, heavy with a simmering, impotent hatred. Someone stepped out of the line and spat on the ground near her boots, a bitter curse following her about empty cupboards and the death of the town. Maria didn't look away, though her heart felt like a leaden weight. To these men, she wasn't the woman who had saved their children. She was the one who had killed the only world they knew, leaving them to rot in a city that no longer had a reason to exist. The train lurched forward with a heavy, mechanical groan, slowly pulling away from the graveyard of rusted hangars and silent chimneys. Maria pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window, watching the familiar skyline of Gary begin to recede. For the first time in nearly a century, the horizon was clear of the thick, orange-brown plumes of smoke that had defined the city's life. The sky was a pale, clean blue, vast and indifferent. She looked out at the quiet streets and the closed shops, knowing the cost of the truth was the total collapse of her home. But as she watched the last of the mill's towers disappear into the mist, she saw the clean horizon and knew that the slow suicide of her people had finally been stopped.